Paris is burning. Barricades in the streets, tear gas in the air, schools shut down, and the French government shaking on its last legs. But here's the twist. The nation that once preached stability and democracy to Africa can't even hold itself together at home. And while Paris collapses under its own weight, in Ouagadougou, one young African leader had already warned that this day would come, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Now, before we dive deeper, let's pause. Where are you watching from right now? Are you in the US dealing with rising costs? In Africa watching a shift in global power? Or maybe in Europe witnessing the chaos up close? Drop your location and your perspective in the comments, because this is not just France's story, it's everyone's reminder of how fragile the system really is. This is Africa Daily Good News, a channel built to connect global events with Africa's voice. We welcome our American viewers, our African brothers and sisters, and everyone across Europe. Thank you for being part of this journey. So stay with us, hit subscribe if you haven't already, and let's uncover why Traoré knew this storm was inevitable. Now, let's step right into the streets of Paris, where the fire first began. Paris woke up to the sound of sirens, not alarm clocks. Entire districts were barricaded with trash bins, steel fences, and the kind of makeshift walls that look less like protests and more like preparations for a siege. For a country that prides itself on exporting order, this was disorder on display. And yet, this wasn't just a moment of noise. It was a deep crack in France's political system that even ordinary citizens could feel beneath their feet. On paper, it started as an argument over austerity, over budget cuts to healthcare, education, and pensions. But in reality, it turned into a test of legitimacy. Tens of thousands filled the boulevards, chanting that they were tired of paying for mistakes they didn't make. Then came the police, the tear gas, the water cannons, images that made Paris look more like a capital under siege than a beacon of democracy. The contradiction was glaring. The same France that lectures the world on stability was struggling to keep its own streets under control. There's something human about that kind of collapse. People often believe chaos belongs somewhere else, until they wake up and find it right outside their apartment door. In New York, for example, most Americans assume protest will stay peaceful, maybe loud but manageable. But what if one morning the subway lines were shut, schools locked, and entire neighborhoods cut off? According to research on social behavior, once people see everyday routines break, their confidence in government drops faster than the stock market. That's exactly what France is experiencing now. And here's a twist buried in the smoke. Many of these protesters weren't hardened activists, but parents, students, workers who just wanted to live normally. I recall the story of a Paris taxi driver interviewed by a local paper. He said, "I've driven through strikes my whole life, but this time it feels like we're not just blocking traffic, we're blocking a future." That line captured the mood more than any politician's speech. It wasn't just about streets being blocked, it was about hope being barricaded too. The irony isn't lost when viewed from Ouagadougou. Ibrahim Traoré, in his speeches, warned that the Western model was not as strong as it looked. Maybe people thought he was exaggerating, but looking at Paris in flames, you start to wonder, did he know all along that the cracks were inevitable? After all, if France can stumble so badly, what does that say about the so-called system it tried to export to Africa? And as the smoke rises over Paris, it sets the stage for a deeper crisis. One not only about protests in the street, but about the collapse inside the halls of power. France lost its prime minister in the middle of a protest storm. François Bayrou didn't step down after a long debate or a calm resignation letter. He was forced out by a parliament that no longer trusted him, and by a public that no longer listened. The timing was brutal. As barricades burned outside, the government collapsed inside. That's not how the textbook of democracy is supposed to read, and yet here it was, unfolding in real time. President Emmanuel Macron rushed to appoint a replacement, Sébastien Lecornu, hoping a new face could calm a restless nation. But imagine starting your first day on the job with half the country already in revolt. That's Le Cornu's reality. And this raises a deeper question. Can leadership exist when the ground beneath it is already crumbling? Americans often think of leadership as a fresh speech or a new plan announced from a podium. Yet research shows that once people lose faith in institutions, even the best speeches sound hollow. France is now living that truth. The paradox runs deeper. A government changes faces, but the anger in the streets doesn't change with it. And here's the quiet twist. When protesters feel their voices don't matter, they stop playing by the rules. A young student in Lyon told a local journalist, "They can swap prime ministers as often as they want. We're still paying the price." That one sentence cuts sharper than any political analysis. It reflects what ordinary people see, politics as a game above, while survival is the struggle below. If people in the US picture Washington in gridlock, imagine it colliding with riots outside Capitol Hill. Most Americans have only known dysfunction inside politics, not outside in the streets at the same time. But when both happen together, the sense of collapse feels absolute. Humans can adapt to one crisis at a time. Two at once breaks the rhythm. That's what makes the French scene so volatile. And this is where Traoré's warning comes back into focus. He spoke about systems that look strong until the day they don't. Back then, critics brushed him off. But with Bayrou gone, Le Cornu walking into fire, and Macron scrambling for control, it seems less like prophecy and more like observation. After all, if France cannot shield its own leaders from collapse, how can it claim authority to lecture Africa on stability? The fall of a prime minister is more than a headline. It's the symbol of a deeper fracture that no quick appointment can fix. And as leadership falters, the streets find new ways to make themselves heard, sometimes louder, sometimes more dangerous, always harder to ignore. That growing defiance is the pulse of the story still to come. High school students were the ones dragging desks into the streets. Teenagers, not yet old enough to vote, turning classrooms into barricades. That image alone shook many in France, because when the youngest decide that rules no longer matter, it tells you the social contract is already broken. The protests were no longer just about pensions or taxes. Workers marched for wages, retirees demanded dignity, and students fought for a future that felt stolen before it even began. And then came the strange collision. Grandparents and teenagers standing side by side, united by the feeling that government no longer listens. In the other hand, it revealed something universal. People endure hardship differently depending on age, but when anger aligns across generations, change comes faster than politicians expect. A quiet twist was buried in those crowds. Some protesters admitted they had never marched before. Ordinary citizens, bakers, nurses, delivery drivers, suddenly carrying placards and chanting slogans. For many Americans watching, it's worth asking, what would it take for you to skip work, shut down schools, and take to the streets? According to surveys on civic engagement, most U.S. citizens prefer online outrage to physical protest. But when survival is at stake, humans always move from screens to sidewalks. One small story captured that mood perfectly. A mother in Marseille, interviewed by local TV, said she wasn't political. She simply joined because her teenage son refused to go to class. "If my child believes his future is blocked," she said, "then as a parent, I have to stand with him." That kind of raw honesty gave the protests legitimacy beyond numbers. It wasn't a matter of left or right, it was a matter of family. And yet, the irony deepens when we step back. France, which often frames itself as the guardian of freedom and stability, now faces children on the front line of rebellion. Traoré's earlier remarks echo here. When systems neglect the young, they invite their own collapse. After all, history shows that societies ignore youth at their peril. From the U.S. civil rights movement to African independence struggles, it's often the young who move first. The sight of students lifting desks into the street was more than symbolism. It was a sign that the next chapter of unrest had already begun, one that no reshuffled cabinet could easily erase. And as France wrestles with its future generation, another question rises quietly in the background. What happens when even international allies begin to doubt the stability of Paris itself? Foreign capitals began to whisper what Paris didn't want to admit. France was no longer looking like the anchor of Europe, but like its weakest link. Markets wobbled, allies questioned stability, and global headlines framed the crisis not as a local protest, but as a European meltdown. For a country that once positioned itself as the voice of order in the West, the image was reversed. France became the warning sign, and here's where the narrative twisted in on itself. In Washington, policymakers expressed concern over the scale of unrest. In Berlin, leaders spoke carefully about respecting French democracy. Yet beneath diplomatic language was a quiet calculation. If France can be shaken this easily, what does it mean for Europe's future? Americans watching may recognize the pattern. Once doubt creeps in, even close allies begin to hedge their bets. According to political behavior research, trust between nations mirrors trust between people. Fragile, slow to build, and quick to collapse once broken. Traoré's perspective suddenly feels sharper. He argued that the Western system was unsustainable, that leaders couldn't endlessly demand sacrifices from their people without consequence. Now, from the streets of Paris to the corridors of Brussels, that argument feels less like theory and more like lived reality. And the irony is brutal. France once told Africa that instability disqualified it from global respect. Today, instability is the headline written about France itself. Consider a short story that hit French television. A business owner from Bordeaux, exporting wine to North America, said his buyers had started calling nervously. They ask me, is France safe? Will shipments arrive? I don't know what to tell them. That one voice carried more than his own worry. It carried the fear of an economy beginning to pay the price of unrest. For ordinary Americans, imagine if a small-town farmer in Iowa had to explain to foreign buyers why his government looked paralyzed. The embarrassment isn't just national, it becomes personal. And when global trust fades, individuals pay first. Jobs, exports, and opportunities shrink. Humans, by nature, assume systems will hold steady until the moment cracks appear, and then the shift feels sudden. After all, most people in Europe believed France would always be the stable partner, until the pictures of tear gas and barricades told a different story. The wider world is now watching France with a new lens, not as a teacher of democracy, but as a struggling student. And as that perception changes, the pressure inside Paris only grows heavier. The collapse of credibility abroad feeds the anger at home, a cycle that no government spin can easily break. The next turn, however, would not just be about reputations overseas, it would come from the streets themselves, where tension was turning into something far more combustible. Flames rose higher than the streetlights. Barricades of wood and metal, lit on fire, painted Paris in an orange glow that felt less like a demonstration and more like a battlefield. Police lines stretched across boulevards, shields clashing against cobblestones, tear gas rolling through neighborhoods where children normally played. For anyone who thought Europe was immune to this kind of chaos, the images shattered that illusion. Reports confirmed hundreds arrested, dozens injured, and entire blocks turned into zones of confrontation. The government called it necessary force, but for those breathing smoke and ducking rubber bullets, it looked like war between citizens and their own state. And here's the paradox. France once lectured Africa about restraint, about how protests should remain peaceful. Now the same France was filling its own streets with riot vans and water cannons. A deeper layer emerges when you listen to those on the ground. One firefighter in Paris told a reporter that his crew was exhausted, not from flames in buildings, but from putting out trash fires set by protesters. He said, "We're not saving lives, we're just chasing anger." That remark revealed something striking. When institutions can't solve problems, ordinary workers become the front line of a political collapse they never chose. In the US, most people picture protests as either quick marches or weekend rallies. But what if daily life truly stopped? Garbage collection halted, schools closed, hospitals understaffed? According to social research, humans tolerate discomfort for a while, but once basic rhythms of survival are interrupted, their patience evaporates. That's when protests tip into something else. Unrest that feels permanent. The twist is that anger spreads faster than solutions. Once a neighborhood sees police push back hard, the next district joins not because of pensions or wages, but because of pride. A young man in Lille told a journalist, "I wasn't going to protest, but when I saw police hitting my neighbors, I had to." That kind of human reaction, defense of dignity, keeps movements alive even when original demands fade. Traoré's observation from Burkina Faso echoes here. He said, "When governments fear their people more than their enemies, collapse begins." For France, that moment seems closer now. After all, if barricades become nightly routine and police begin to look like an occupying force, then democracy is no longer a debate in parliament. It's a fight on the pavement. As the flames reflected on the Seine, the world began to realize this wasn't just another strike season. It was a portrait of a society testing its breaking point, and from that image, the story was preparing to move towards something even heavier: the question of what future France can still claim to lead. France woke up to a question it never thought it would face. Who still believes in its future? Not long ago, Paris was the stage of diplomacy, the city of summits and signatures. Now, it is the backdrop of barricades, a government scrambling for control and a society doubting itself. The contrast is almost absurd. One of the richest countries on earth unable to buy back the trust of its own people. The latest statements from officials tried to project calm, promising reforms and dialogue. Yet the streets told a different story. Protesters didn't pack up because a new prime minister was sworn in. They stayed, louder and more defiant, signaling that political reshuffles were bandages on a wound that runs deeper. The nation's credibility, both at home and abroad, is now in question. For decades, France presented itself as a teacher to Africa, insisting on lessons of stability and order. Today, the teacher has lost the classroom. And here's the subtle twist. As France falters, voices in Africa are noticing. Ibrahim Traoré, speaking from Burkina Faso, framed it clearly. Western systems look permanent until the day they collapse. His warning was dismissed before. Now, with France shaken, it sounds prophetic. After all, if Paris cannot hold its own society together, how can it claim the moral high ground abroad? There's also the human element hidden beneath statistics. A shopkeeper in Nantes told a reporter, "I no longer plan next month's orders. I just try to survive today." That kind of uncertainty is what drains a nation quietly. Most Americans know the feeling when bills pile up and confidence in leaders shrinks. It doesn't matter how wealthy the country is, the anxiety feels the same. And when ordinary people stop planning for tomorrow, societies drift toward collapse faster than governments admit. The global audience is watching closely. Will France stabilize, or will the unrest spread? Humans, if given a chance, usually choose stability over chaos, but when systems deny them dignity, they choose the street. History, from Washington in 1968 to Lagos in 2020, proves that pattern over and over again. France is simply the latest example. As night falls over Paris once more, the mood is not of celebration, but of suspense. The barricades may be cleared for a few hours, but the questions remain. And in that fragile silence lies the biggest irony of all. While the West once painted Africa as unstable, it is now Africa, through voices like Traoré's, that points out the cracks in the Western mirror. The story doesn't end here. It only shifts to a new chapter, where the world begins asking what happens when yesterday's teacher becomes today's warning sign. France called itself the capital of democracy, yet tonight it looks more like the capital of doubt. That is the irony that history loves to deliver. The same nation that once designed rules for others now struggles to follow its own. The barricades in Paris are not just wood and flames. They are symbols that credibility, once lost, cannot be rebuilt overnight. The news is undeniable. France faces its deepest crisis in years, with protests shaking institutions, a prime minister forced out, and a society on edge. But the story carries a human layer too. A student in Paris said, "We don't trust anyone anymore, not politicians, not promises." That statement captures something universal. When trust breaks, humans turn to the only power left: the street. In America, people often assume protests are a choice. In reality, they are a last resort when the system leaves no other outlet. And here's the hidden twist. While the West once pointed at Africa as the unstable frontier, it is now African leaders like Ibrahim Traoré who remind the world that instability does not belong to one continent. It belongs to any nation that forgets the value of listening to its people. After all, systems collapse the same way families break apart, not in one sudden blow, but in small cracks ignored too long. So where does this leave us? Perhaps the question is not whether France will recover, but what lessons others will draw. Will Africa keep being lectured by a Europe in flames? Will Americans recognize the fragility of their own institutions before cracks spread further? According to surveys of social trust, most societies only realize the danger when it's already visible on the streets. Maybe that's the warning Paris is sending. As we close this chapter, one truth remains clear. France burns, and Traoré knew it would happen. The real story is not just about one country's protests, but about the shifting balance of credibility worldwide. If you found value in this perspective, share it, subscribe, and join the conversation. Tell us, what does this moment remind you of in your own country? Because sometimes, the story of Paris is the story of all of us.